Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I hope everyone out there who's listening, I hope they're all doing just as fantastic. The guest that we have on is a return customer. We've had him on numerous times. He's an amazing author, and he always dabbles in these topics that you and I never realized that we enjoyed or we were super interested in until he brings them to our attention. And that is the case today. There's no exception here. But Tim, there's no exception on why I haven't asked you how you are today. How are you?
I'm doing great over here. And yeah, you nailed it. Daniel Stone is one of our favorite guests over here. He's been on a couple times before. This is his third appearance. He's written several books. One is called Sinkable, and that is about the culture surrounding the Titanic and its obsession, the deep sea, and the shipwreck of the Titanic. And honestly, I know I say this every time we talk about Daniel Stone, but this was one of my favorite books that I've ever had my hands on. It's an unbelievable book. I listened to it twice, so I guess I was lying about having my hands on it because I had the audiobook version, but I listened twice. And then The Food Explorer, Lance, is also a really fascinating book. The True Adventures of the globe-trotting botanist who transformed what America eats. And that was a great interview with Daniel Stone as well. But today, Lance, we're speaking about his newest book, and it's called American Poison, A Deadly Invention and the Woman Who Battled for Environmental Justice.
It's funny, I wanted to bring this up to Daniel when we were talking to him. You just mentioned his book Sinkable, which is a book that I read as well and I really liked, but you were like, you're on that book. Like, that is one of your favorites of all time.
I loved it.
That topic is really significant to you. You really love that topic. And The Food Explorer is like the other way around. I totally dig that book. That's like, it was the best one, one of the best that I had listened to last year or the year previous. So I wanted to make a joke, like, he's just writing books for you and I. He's just swapping them on and off. Like, this one I feel like was good for both of us though. So he wrote one for you, he wrote one for me. And now we wrote one for the both of us with American Poison. This one's fantastic. This one is a cautionary tale, people. It's a cautionary tale. Once you get to the end of this book, you'll realize all of these things that happened back then, back in the early 1900s with lead and all of these big conglomerates, these big manufacturing companies, this industrial boom. Profit is the most important thing, and it's hard, almost impossible to manage those in charge of that type of wealth at the expense of people's health and well-being. Again, a cautionary tale. It's just something that keeps happening over and over in history. This is lead that he's talking about here, that Alice Hamilton is fighting against. Really, once you start it, it's really tough to put it down. Yeah, it is a really interesting story, and Daniel is a great interview, and he describes the story just perfectly. Make sure to pick up Daniel Stone's books, and especially his new one, American Poison, wherever you get your books. And you can go to his website at danielstonebooks.com.
We'll be right back with author Daniel Stone, and make sure to follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
Don't eat the paint. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome back to the podcast, Daniel Stone. Daniel, how are you today?
Great. Very, very happy to be back.
We're happy to have you back, and I feel like you were just in my ears a half hour ago because you read your new book, and Tim and I have listened to it as an audiobook, and it's fantastic. You do your own narration. But before we get into that book, it's an incredible piece of work. Can you let the audience know a little bit about yourself and what brings you back on the show?
Sure. I am a historian and author. I write mostly narrative nonfiction history from the early 20th century. I find that to be the pivotal era of America. It embodies our national growth and national spirit. It explains so much about today. And I try to find pivotal characters, people who embody that moment or who hinge on a moment of history. And I found that with American Poison in a woman named Alice Hamilton.
Yeah. Now, what inspired you to tell this specific story?
I teach environmental science. I teach to grad students at Johns Hopkins, and I had never heard of Alice Hamilton. And she is this person without this kind of enormous fame that followed her after death, but someone who is famous or deserves to be in her own right. Alice Hamilton was a doctor. She was an occupational inspector, really, in the early 20th century. Because I had never heard of her, I thought that was kind of weird, right? I teach this subject, and here's kind of the founding mother of the environmental movement in the 20th century. Where has she been? And so I dug deeper into her. I found her letters and her diaries and archives and pieced together what really was a remarkable story of a person and a moment in history that we don't often hear about. A lot of people have forgotten about. Kind of explains our entire national story, how we got to where we are and what we value.
She is an amazing character, and she surrounds herself by other amazing characters, whether they're good folks or bad folks in this particular story. But it's pivotal in the history of this country in a lot of ways, from the media interpretation of what happened to how they were trying to scramble to figure out the science of everything. But before we get into all of that, can you just take us back in time to the country and where we were at as a country right around World War I, maybe a little bit before, and how maybe some of the advancements right at the turn of the century played into all of this leading up to what she was discovering and working on?
This was a very exciting time in America. The first 2 decades of the 20th century were an era of rebirth. We had the Industrial Revolution, we had Reconstruction after the Civil War, and kind of with the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt in 1901, we start to see a new America emerge. And very quickly, we start to see trends that embody that new birth. Big advances in technology, especially cars, big advances in fashion, in dancing, in clothing. We saw advances in rights. Women allowed the right to vote. We saw America's influence grow around the world, which explains partly our involvement in World War I. And by about 1920, there's this spirit coast to coast that America is on the rise, that this is the decade where things are going to be magic, where things are going to happen. I like this era because it really mirrors a lot of what's happening today, right? We're in the 20s again, and we have all of these enormous advances in technology and culture, and we're having this big national debate over whether these are good things or whether things are moving too fast or who's uplifted and who's put down. And it was just like that back then. And that's the context for this story. So much was changing, so much was exciting, and some of it was happening too fast.
And what does that mean, just for folks who aren't too familiar with, the history going back that far? Like, what was the Industrial Revolution?
The Industrial Revolution really occurred mostly in the late 19th century, but it continued to have effects of things being able to be done faster and better. And we think of it mostly with factories, with manufacturing, with shipping, putting things together. Communication was much faster. The invention of devices like the telephone, the automobile in the late 19th century. All of these were enormous leaps in what was possible in human capacity. And they all required places, factories to put things together, to manufacture pieces, to figure out how to fuse them together, to figure out how to produce a lot of them, and then to sell them, and then to ship them to everyone who wanted. This was an enormous economic growth spurt of the country that really was made possible by advances in engineering, doing things and making things better and faster.
And is that necessarily a good thing or a bad thing? Or are we just kind of taking it for what it is?
It is what it is. The story of America and the world is impossible to separate from the Industrial Revolution. I mean, prior to this, most people lived on farms. They were farmers. They rarely, if ever, traveled much farther than their hometown, maybe their state. It was very difficult to grow food, to raise children, let alone have much in the sense of pleasure, in the sense of driving a nice car or going on a nice vacation, things we think of as inherent to life today. So yeah, Industrial Revolution was great, but that's not to say there weren't winners and losers in this big advancement. And the winners, of course, as they usually are, were richer people who could afford all these nice things, who owned the factories, who could really benefit financially. And the losers, losers is a broad term, but there was, as there still is now, kind of an underclass of people who were responsible for working in these factories. A lot of them were immigrants or people who didn't speak English. extremely poor people who were forced to work for very low wages. This was in an era before there was any laws protecting them. So human life was very expendable. A lot of these workers tended to get hurt, get sick, and die, and they were completely unseen. Nobody noticed, and if they did, nobody really cared. So that was kind of the downside, the dark underbelly of the Industrial Revolution and the spirit force of capitalism that continued this trend forward.
Yeah, and you even mention the book The Jungle, which is a famous book by Upton Sinclair. This book tells the sordid tales of factory working and all of those elements that are just proven to be like so harmful. Can you give folks a little bit of a synopsis on how this all started with The Jungle?
Yeah, The Jungle was a very influential book that actually started from a journalist named Upton Sinclair, who in the first few years of the 20th century started to investigate. He investigated the packing houses and the stockyards around Chicago. And this was basically where the nation's meat came from. Everyone benefited from this, but nobody really knew what it took to create, the number of cattle they had or the livestock and how people got sick and died in this process. So he started to do an investigative report. He strung together many months of reporting and came across these astounding findings. I mean, people living like 12 people to a room in these boarding houses that were practically falling over, people forced to work 20 hours a day on these factory floors, people who would work next to like pig boiling vats, and people would regularly fall in and just be crushed up and sent out into the world, horrifying things. And the reason this was so influential was because no one had ever heard any of these types of stories before. And so you think of the kind of Victorian sensibilities of people, the higher class at the time, forced to confront these harsh realities. And it was astounding. And so what Upton Sinclair did was he pieced together a lot of these different reports and these different people, and he turned it into a novel. The Jungle is very lightly fictionalized, but it's based on his months of reporting in these horrifying conditions.
That's how we run our podcasting business over here. I got a vat of boiling pig right next to me.
Could you imagine? Oh my gosh.
Tim's going to write an expose on it.
After my 20-hour editing day. So can you tell us a little bit more about Alice Hamilton? How does she get involved in this story, and what does she do?
Yeah, so Alice Hamilton was born right after the Civil War. She grew up in a very wealthy family in Indiana, and she could have been just wealthy, right? She could have followed her parents, grandparents, and lived in a big mansion in Indiana and controlled a company or an industry. But she really wanted to pursue a life of being helpful. She really wanted to sort of take almost a vow of charity and help those who needed help. And so this drives her first to medical school. She gets her medical degree when she's in her late teens, really. Eventually, she wants to go work in a settlement house. And there was one big one at the time. It was called Hull House in Chicago. It still exists. You could still visit it. And Hull House was basically a place where everyone came together, everyone of different races, classes. It was a melting pot of culture at a time where cultures didn't really melt together. And so the whole idea behind a settlement house is what we now call like social work, where people could come and learn to speak a new language or get help applying for a job or registering to vote, filling out their taxes, all these types of things that could help maybe a poor, marginalized immigrant rise up. And so Alice Hamilton went to live and work at Hull House in 1897. She did not make a lot of money doing it. In fact, she paid to live there and had this contact with all sorts of people she never would have come in contact. Most of them were poor. Most of them were living in very crowded tenements. Many of them would bring their babies to Hull House because that was the only place they could get any person with a medical degree to look at a sick baby. And what started to happen because she lived there and did this work with babies is she started to notice other people who were sick in the neighborhood. So she'd go to like a house of a baby who was sick, and she'd hear the father of the baby coughing in the next room, like really coughing, like from his gut. And, then she'd try to treat what was wrong with him. And then, the next day she'd be treating a different baby and she'd hear another man coughing or with a deep stomach pain or some other notable thing wrong with him. And this happened enough that she started to piece together the patterns, right? Oh, your cough sounds like that other guy's cough. Oh, you both work in the same factory together that handles, a toxic substance. Oh, you have a problem with your wrists. Well, I've seen 4 other people this week who had the same wrist problem. Oh, and you also all work together. And so she called this what we call now a shoe leather epidemiology, basically piecing together these patterns on foot, right? She'd go door to door and piece them together, and she'd jot down notes with the goal of finding the patterns, finding the causes of these men's illnesses, and then trying to convince the factory bosses or the business owners that they had dangerous working conditions and that they needed to change, 1 or 2 things in order to prevent their workers from getting sick.
She is an amazing character, and she kind of reminds me of Isabella Stewart Gardner. Tim and I covered the Gardner Museum heist, and very independent, putting an emphasis on doing things on their own and accomplishing things on their own. And you had mentioned that she went to medical school. What was that like? How does somebody in her position, how did she integrate into that community?
Well, she didn't really have trouble going and getting into medical school. She was from a rich family. She had good credentials. She was very smart. She had good grades, all the things that you get when you're growing up in a privileged position. Where she wasn't privileged was she was a woman in an era where not a lot of women pursued professional paths at all. And so she was going into a especially high one, of medicine. And so she got her medical degree, but she wasn't really taken seriously, enough to be maybe a influential doctor of her day or working for a major university or maybe leading an area of medicine. And that also kind of indicated why she probably wanted to go into social work. Here was an area where a doctor, man or woman, whoever, could be very useful and immediately. And so that was an area that she pursued throughout her entire life. And she had a very long life. She is continually confronted with sexism, right? No surprise there, like early 20th century. But rather than despair about all the ways that she's pushed aside, that she's bulldozed, that she's ignored, that she's insulted, she just continues doing her work. And she continues to try to apply her medical background and her expertise to help as many people as she could.
Yeah, it seems like she was one of the first people who really fought for people over profit, and that kind of makes this story timely. Can you tell us about the poison part of this story?
So Alice Hamilton, I mentioned, was a doctor. She was a toxicologist. She did this shoe leather epidemiology. And what she really did was inspect for poisons. In factories, she'd find these industrial materials that were loosely tested, if tested at all. And she'd try to figure out which were toxic at which quantities and find the patterns and find basically the treatments or the cures or the ways to avoid them. And she did this with all sorts of different elements. She worked with tungsten, she worked with rayon, boron gas. All throughout her life, she's jotting notes and writing studies about any toxic element she finds. The most toxic element, and the one that is a continual through line in her life and work, is lead. She studied lead and she inspected factories that made lead. She saw the damage lead could do very early in her life and career, but she was not the person who discovered lead was bad. This is about 100 plus years ago. We have known that lead is damaging and dangerous in almost any quantity since the Roman Empire. I mean, this is like very well known, very well documented. In fact, there is this long running debate among historians and scientists about whether the amount of lead that the Romans used, for their aqueducts and their jewelry and their flatware, their makeup, everything, their food, coincided with the fall of the Roman Empire. So, there was no secret that lead was damaging and dangerous. She wanted to figure out how much of it did it take to be dangerous and how could it be avoided. And so lead was really the scourge of her life. And it's what I call the American poison. It is still with us today. It is something she continually fought against. And the story really hinges on one main battle she had in the 1920s over General Motors putting lead into gasoline.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
Okay, so good segue to introduce the character of Thomas Midgley, who sort of rode the wave of all this and did some pretty questionable public displays to prove that, hey, this is fine. It's not as bad as we all think.
Thomas Midgley is this great character in American history who, again, embodies the spirit of industrial growth at all costs, right? A spirit we still have today. He was an engineer who grew up in the shadow of Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, who really wanted to be this great industrialist. He wanted to go into automobiles. This is the 19 teens. He is a young man trying to build his career, and automobiles are the most exciting industry there is. I mean, it's basically like what AI is now. Everyone who, is smart, who's ambitious, wants to go into the future. And that's what automobiles were in the, 19-aughts and the 19 teens. And so Thomas Midgley gets a job basically at a company that becomes part of General Motors. His job is to make cars better. And so he invents, a type of radiator, he invents a type of engine light, and then he is instructed by his boss to confront the biggest problem facing cars in the early 1920s. And this is the problem of engine knock. Engine knock we still have, but back then it was really the limit of what an engine was capable of. When you pushed a car to its maximum, pedal all the way down, the engine would basically become inefficient. Fuel would not combust properly, or it would combust prematurely, and it would create this whole inefficient chain of dominoes that would fall through the engine, and it would start clanging. And this was very embarrassing if you were driving a nice car down the street or up a hill and it's clanging, announcing to everyone that your car, something wrong with your car. Everyone hated engine knock. It was a problem for almost everyone. And it was a problem of gasoline quality. And so it really was a question of science. Can someone innovate a way around engine knock? Can we innovate gasoline in a way to eliminate engine knock? And Thomas Midgley took this challenge very seriously. And he knew that whoever did it would not only become very famous, but become very rich. We still have engine knock, and usually it's a low quality gasoline issue. Back then it was universal. Everyone had it. Basically, the problem was it didn't have a high enough octane. It needed to have a higher octane to make it burn hotter and longer to make the car more powerful.
So why would it be such an important thing? I know you said it was embarrassing. People wanted to go faster. They saw the potential.
Exactly. So again, this is an era of extreme growth in almost every area of life. And cars embody that more than anything else. And cars, from the early days of, the first cars that came from France and the UK, and, we start to grow, and then Henry Ford, all of these cars were incremental progress, and they were getting better and better. And by the 1920s, we sort of reached this limit where cars could not go any faster. They couldn't be any more powerful. If you think of horsepower as kind of this metric, we reached the maximum number of horses, and people wanted more. Maybe cars topped out at 40 miles an hour, and some people were saying, I want to go faster. I want cars that are even better. It's sort of like if your iPhone camera just topped out at 60 pixels an inch or something. You'd be like, no, give me more, right? And so it was that kind of spirit of every year there were new cars that came out. We had reached the maximum, so there was demand for more, better cars. Knock was really the limit. So whoever could figure that out, it was kind of like a glass ceiling, could kind of initiate a new growth spurt in automobiles.
Now, with the vehicles that engine knock still happens with, would the Supreme gas help that issue now?
I'm not an automobile expert, but yeah, generally higher octane helps. This is getting ahead of the story, but the solution back then was to put lead in gasoline to eliminate knock. We no longer put lead in gasoline. Now we put kind of a broad mixture of chemicals. The main one is ethanol. And so putting more ethanol in gasoline would eliminate knock. It also has to do with your engine, how much residue is in your engine, how much pressure builds up in each chamber as it compresses. So yeah, there are ways to innovate it. But back then, it was a giant puzzle. A lot of engineers, a lot of chemists working on it.
And what were some of the big players, the heavy hitters, as far as the contractors and the companies that would be buying this? Who would Midgley be getting rich from?
Well, he'd be getting rich from consumers. There would be a royalty on every gallon of gas sold for whoever could figure out the solution and then patent it. You can imagine that there are chemists and engineers all over the country. There's not a lot of them, but enough of them that they're all competing because they know that if they invent chemical compound X to mix with gasoline, that they can start charging for that chemical compound X in every gallon it goes in. And so Midgley calculated that it would be probably about 3 cents per gallon of gasoline. And a gallon of gas at the time costs like 20 to 25 cents. It was a meaningful percentage of what gas cost. At the time, I don't remember the numbers, but there were several million gallons of gasoline burned every year, and the number was going up. And so it was very easy to imagine that 10 years in the future, there would be several 100 million gallons of gasoline burned, and eventually maybe 1 billion. Today, of course, it's, I think, several dozen billion gallons burned every year. So it's a very steeply rising curve. But even back then, he calculated that 3 cents a gallon would add up to more than $300 million per year to whoever figured this out.
Wow, that's a lot. And what were the problems that adding lead to gasoline led to?
Yeah, so Midgley tried out a lot of different substances. He spent more than 3 years sort of mixing and matching. It's very like mad scientist-y. What he did is just like pouring test tubes and other test tubes and putting it into the chamber of an engine. And he eventually gets down to lead, and a specific type of lead called tetraethyl lead. Tetraethyl, 5 ethyl groups combined with lead. The ethyls make the lead soluble, so it can mix evenly in a gallon of gasoline. He is excited, astounded, enthusiastic when he discovers this. His boss, named Charles Kettering, is also very excited, right? This is like the jackpot. They found it. And almost immediately, they start to hear from scientists, including Alice Hamilton, who is saying, wait a minute, no. This is a terrible idea. Again, we have known for centuries that lead is bad. I understand it works in this context, but surely something else can too. So do not go down this route. People have died specifically from tetraethyl lead in the past. Spare the world. Nobody quite knew the exact problems that this would invite. To your question, no one knew at the time other than that lead was bad and that there would be some global cost to doing this. In the short term, it just appeared to be a very localized benefit, right? Local benefit mainly to General Motors, that they could patent this, they could charge a royalty on it, and they could undergo this process, which I argue in my book kind of became classic American, that they could privatize the benefits and socialize the costs.
There were some terrifying results of these factory workers becoming poisoned. Can you give us an example of what happened to these folks?
Yeah. So leaded gasoline appears in 1923. There's a huge advertising campaign to spread it, coast to coast. And that required ramping up production a lot. And so most of the production was happening at a few different factories. DuPont was trying to make some. Standard Oil was trying to make some. They were making the tetraethyl lead that would be mixed with the gasoline. And at one of the Standard Oil plants in Elizabeth, New Jersey, just across the river from Manhattan, a few men started to go insane. And this is like a very early 20th century story, just calling men insane. And, they'd undergo these wild transformations at work, and they'd go crazy and start fighting people and sweating and cursing and have to leave early. One man even jumped off a second floor window and died. And so this is like a horrifying story. And because it's next to Manhattan, reporters, there are a lot of them there, start to pick up the story, and they're going, what's causing this insanity? And so this grows into a big media storm over these men. And there are 4 of them who go insane and die, but there's also dozens more of them who work there who undergo very, more minor effects of maybe neurological disease and damage. All these reporters are like, something's going on here. What is it? And eventually they get to the bottom of it. It's tetraethyl lead. It's basically ethyl gasoline, leaded gasoline. And this threatens the future of leaded gasoline. But it also vindicates Alice Hamilton, who not that long before said, I told you this would happen. This is dangerous in almost any quantity. Here are men who worked with it closely. And so, of course, they had the most dramatic effects. But everyone else in the world who is exposed to any quantity of this will also have some exposure and some effect too.
Really love how the media comes into play here. Like, when it was okay to promote going faster and getting bigger and using this product to enhance your life, get rid of engine knock, no more embarrassment. Like the media was on top of that, but they turned so quick. Like then they wanted to bring it down so fast. And you brought up that New York City was like the epicenter of the newspaper industry, and everybody wanted a piece of this story that was going to be the headline. Can you just give us a little bit of an example of how they turned on Midgley and Led?
I mean, they turned on him temporarily, right? This was a salacious story. It was very exciting. It was a mystery. What was this they called it loony gas that was being made in this plant. What was it? And no one was talking, so it became this big mystery for days and days. And eventually it came out that it was ethyl-leaded gasoline, the compounds that made it possible. And that made it a big media storm and a big threat to General Motors and Standard Oil. But very quickly, Standard Oil of New Jersey and General Motors and all these companies that made a lot of money off this thing, that have a very lucrative product, they fight back. And they have the pockets, they have the benefit, they have the expertise on their staff to wage what we now call public relations. Back then, it was very new. One man named Ivy Lee, who's basically the father of public modern PR. And he was contracted by John D. Rockefeller to basically help in situations like this. They blanket the country with newspaper ads, basically explaining everything's fine. What happened in New Jersey was like a one-off freak accident from these men who were improperly trained. Blame the men. They take their PR campaign to health boards of different states, to the federal government, and they're very successful in convincing not just federal officials, but also state officials and members of the public that don't worry. That was a weird thing that happened. We're on top of it. We're going to make sure it never happens again.
You also specifically referenced a single word that they used that kind of changed everything. And I thought that was really cool, how they unintentionally used the word remote, that there was a remote chance. I think you called it a squishy word. Like no one can even define, like, does that mean it's bad?
After that whole incident in New Jersey, there was this very brief cursory review, a study of whether this stuff was actually very bad. And the study was done very fast. It wasn't, very deep. And the conclusion was that the risk of danger from leaded gas was, like you said, remote. And remote means so little, right? Like remote could mean, Jupiter is remote. So is New Jersey from my house. It's like it could mean anything. It could mean a little bit. It could mean a lot. And it doesn't contextualize just how bad this is. And so seemingly remote, the term they used, basically allowed the industry, in this case, General Motors, to say, yeah, there's practically no danger at all. And when you say there's practically no danger, it becomes very easy to say, there's no danger. It becomes almost a certainty.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
And so how did Alice fight back?
Yeah, so she fought back in the media too. She realized that this fight would be made in public. And so she had made a lot of friends over her life. She knew a lot of influential people, and probably the most influential in this context was Walter Lippmann. He was a journalist and he ran part of the New York World. That was a very influential newspaper, also in New York at the time. And she convinces Lippmann to really go after General Motors and their subsidiary that made ethyl gasoline. The New York World launches what they call a crusade against ethyl, and they're pointing out all these inconsistencies of how it was made and who made it and how much money was at stake, how many doctors and scientists had warned that exactly this type of thing would happen. And she thought if she could convince enough people and really damage the reputation of leaded gasoline, that General Motors would just cut it loose and say, all right, this is a scarlet letter, let's just find something else that works. And she wanted to put the pressure on them that way.
And you introduced a couple of characters that I'd never heard of in Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler. These are two incredible, fascinating individuals. Can you tell us a little bit about these two and how they contributed to the story?
Yeah, Norris and Gettler were the medical investigators, very senior for New York City at the time. These are fascinating men. I think of them as like the Mulder and Scully of New York at the time. They would come in when something crazy happened and try to figure it out and do these all toxicology reports and report to the media what they found. Gettler and Norris were so fascinating. In fact, they've been the subject of their own books by my colleague Deborah Blum. They were basically the SVU detectives who would arrive at the scene, take a look at what happened, go back to the lab, run the samples, and complete their report. And so they were the ones influential in discovering exactly these early effects that tetraethyl lead was having on the workers in the factory who handled it.
Just curious, was car exhaust more dangerous when there was leaded gasoline?
Yeah, I mean, the effect of lead in gas was a particulate. So the lead would not be burned. It would essentially come out of the tailpipe with all the other kind of puffy gases of exhaust. They'd be these tiny little fragments of lead that would then get embedded on sidewalks, in streets, in people's houses, on people's clothes, all over. And as we learn later, because of the way this lead dust settled, that in terms of exposure, you had a much higher chance of getting lead exposure and even lead poisoning if you lived on a busy street or next to a highway than if you lived out in the country where very few cars passed.
But Midgley went on stage and soaked his hands in it and inhaled it for like 30 seconds. So it must be safe, right?
Well, so in this media storm that followed these men going insane in New Jersey, Midgley and the PR team do this demonstration, and they're basically arguing to the media, this stuff is fine, it's safe, there's no problem. And so he goes on stage and he says, I'm going to prove it. And he takes out a beaker of what he calls pure tetraethyl lead, which is very dangerous stuff. I mean, it's not like cyanide, but it's not far. He sticks his hands in it for 30 seconds. He puts it under his nose and inhales for another 30 seconds. And, this is a very compelling and vivid scene, especially for reporters to write about. There are two parts to this that are rather interesting. One, no one really tested and no one really knows if it was true tetraethyl lead or if it was a substance with the same color. No one knows. It seems odd that he would do this. Midgley also had lead poisoning. He worked with lead for most of his life and career. He invented leaded gasoline. And so for the first time in 1922, Midgley undergoes lead poisoning and has to convalesce in Florida for several months. Later in his life, he also has the effects of someone who worked with toxic chemicals like lead. And so he did not escape this episode scot-free, but it was very compelling at the time to anyone who saw it or read about it in their newspaper that, hey, how bad could it be if this guy who invented it is willing to, risk his own body for it?
And it's not a direct comparison, but when I read that part or heard you narrate that part, it reminded me of when Steve Jobs had introduced the first iPhone, and it was like all wired behind him and no one knew if it was going to work, but it somehow worked. It was like so scotch taped together for that particular demonstration. And that's what I was reminded of when I heard that part. What is it about the showmanship that is important?
So much about making a public argument or convincing the public of anything is projecting confidence. If they see that something's unsure or that you're unsure, they'll abandon you. If you can project confidence that you are the person to get something done or that what you're saying is true, then yeah, people want to believe. People want to believe in something amazing or something remarkable. And so the fact that most of the country was thinking, oh my God, this stuff is poisonous. And Thomas Midgley goes out there, not quivering, not afraid, but bold and confident and says, it is not, and I will prove it. That is a very compelling argument.
How long did it take Midgley to come down with the lead poisoning after the stunt on stage?
The first time he did was even before that stunt on stage, because he had worked with it in the lab. So he developed leaded gas in 1921. And by late 1922, he had the first effects of exposure and had to, again, go down to Florida for several months just to do nothing. Throughout his life, he developed a series of body aches and pains. He also got really weird. He got very manic. He was erratic, hard to work with. He was hard to be married to for his wife. I mean, they had these big drag out fights. And again, these are not something I or anyone could link to lead exposure directly with him, but they are the symptoms of someone who has a little bit too much exposure. In the 1940s, Midgley starts to basically feel tingling in his legs, which is another exposure of, effect of long-term exposure. He is diagnosed with polio, later on is sort of how his life ends, but he had these problems his whole life. What's interesting about his own lead poisoning is that someone might look at it and say, well, obviously this stuff is poisonous. It poisoned the man who invented it. How much clearer could it be? And Midgley's response was, well, I work with it directly. I have the most exposure of anyone because I'm handling it in my lab. So of course I would have the effects. But everyone else in the world is perfectly safe. They're managing tiny quantities of it. He was essentially saying, I'm a firefighter. Of course I worked in, fire buildings, and of course I got burned, but no one else is working in buildings on fire. So you're fine.
And not to give any spoilers away, but how did Alice Hamilton prepare herself for this inevitable takedown?
Her hands were a bit tied because she did not have a company that she controlled. She didn't have deep pocket. She wasn't making a lot of money from leaded gas or even from her day job, which she worked at Harvard at the time in the 1920s. So she really had the media and she had her scientific expertise. And so eventually this debate over whether leaded gasoline is safe to proceed or should be stopped finds its way up to the federal government. And the U.S. Public Health Service, which is the main agency we now call Health and Human Services, decides to hold a conference. They held a conference in May of 1925, almost exactly 100 years ago, and they invite everyone on every side of this issue. There's really only two sides, but everyone who had an opinion or an expertise about leaded gas is invited. That includes Thomas Midgley and his boss, Charles Kettering. It includes a lot of scientists from a lot of different universities, including Alice Hamilton, her colleagues at Harvard, other colleagues at Yale, colleagues from abroad, colleagues from different companies that all had a stake in this. And they all come together in this one building in May of 1925 to air out their debate and see what happens, if they could come to a resolution. And what's interesting about these government type debates that happened in those days, they were open with the spirit of everyone's views are welcome and we'll find within them the ultimate bottom line. But they were also stacked. There were subtle biases built into this structure. And in this case, the bias was the industry was invited to speak first. And basically, this is a one-day conference. They filled the entire morning session with, I think, what we could call industry propaganda. A lot of it was true, but it was also half-truths or stretched truths of how great leaded gasoline was, how it was the future of America, how it was the engine driving economic growth. And that left the scientists like Alice Hamilton the afternoon to sort of respond and to try to take down. The afternoon is not when everyone's at their most alert or when everyone wants to be paying most attention. The air gets kind of stale. It got really hot. And so by the end of the day, there's really no resolution. And the people who had made the biggest impression were the industry people. And so when it eventually gets studied one final time by the government, there's really not enough momentum from the scientists to stop what is a very lucrative and powerful economic force of leaded gas.
Can you tell us a little bit about lead paint? There was a part in your book where they had sort of sung the praises of lead paint, and that part was very shocking to me. Kids were licking the walls.
It's delicious.
It is delicious. Don't lick your walls. The whole story of lead is of finding its magical qualities. And lead is a miracle element. And that's why for thousands of years, we have sort of kept turning to it. Very easy and cheap to find. It doesn't corrode. It makes colors brighter. It makes flavors more vibrant. It makes colors on, in makeup, even more colorful. And, so all of these uses over time, because lead really delivered on its premise. That's why we had lead pipes. Lead pipes are as old as Roman plumbing. In fact, the term plumbing comes from the word plumbum, is how you say it in Latin. So all of it was very well known. Even in like the late 19th century, people were still using lead paint because it made colors brighter. And it made colors brighter in such an exciting way that there were advertising campaigns about the colors that you could anticipate from getting leaded paint. And it was a very much keeping up with the Joneses vibe. Your neighbors have these amazing colors in their house. You need them too. And again, we knew that lead was, probably not a great idea, but that was also like, how much lead could there be? And also, who's licking their walls? Eventually, it became almost a joke that if you produced paint that had colors like cotton candy or pistachio, that it would invite kids to want to lick the paint and see. And it was a terrible thing, as you can imagine. We actually used lead paint in this country far longer than we should have. And still, in every house in America, when it's bought or sold, you have to disclose if it has lead paint, and a lot of them do.
I'm laughing because it's so unbelievable to me. And you said it right off the top, like they've known this for thousands and thousands of years. It probably caused Roman emperors to burn their cities down. It probably is responsible for Caligula's behavior. And yet we're like, well, we just really want that brighter shade of pistachio paint. Now, why don't we ever learn?
Well, there is like an element of human hubris that I have found in a lot of my books of believing that at every given moment, and perhaps even now, we have arrived at the enlightened stage, that this chemical element that befell, civilizations before us, they just didn't know how to handle it, or they didn't know how to protect themselves. But we're smarter than they are, and we can handle it now. That's true with a lot of things we're still producing. I mean, we think of microplastics around our world everywhere today that are undoubtedly a bad idea, right? These are going to have some like horrifying environmental, human health effects long into the future. But we also believe that we know how to handle them, or we could eliminate them, or they're worth it anyway. And so that, I think, is a common American theme, but maybe global theme. Why these questions keep coming up. It's settled science, lead is bad. Why does it keep appearing?
And is it not true that you've written this book because you're really in the pocket of the big horse industry?
I want to go back to horses. Is that what you're saying?
That it's completely funded by the horse industry.
Yes. Oh, man.
Let's go back to horses.
Congratulations on the new book. It's really amazing book and a really awesome story. What do you have coming next?
Yeah, I'm working on my next book now. It's coming out next year, and it's about a big heist from the Library of Congress in about 1900. A wild story of two men who stole George Washington's diary from the library, and a wild transition for the library itself, which is now, and has been for a long time, the world's biggest library and most authoritative house of human knowledge on Earth.
So I cannot wait to have you back on to discuss that, because you keep doing this thing where I didn't know that this was going to be so interesting until Daniel Stone wrote it. I knew lead was bad, but now I have all of this new knowledge about this incredible character, Alice Hamilton, and all of the other characters that are in this story, and I can't wait for the one about George Washington's diary.
Thank you, guys. I'd be very happy to come on and join you again.